We start with questions. Secretary of State for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, Dr. Allison Gardner.
Question number 1, please, Mr. Speaker.
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and Merry Christmas to you and to all your staff. And with permission, I would like to group questions 1 and 5. And I would also like to put on record my sympathy with everyone affected by water outages in Southampton, and I discussed this with the CEO yesterday. We will have a public consultation in the new year on the formula that allocates flood defence funding to ensure that the challenges facing businesses and rural and coastal communities are adequately taken into account. Protecting communities from flooding is a top priority, and later today I'm having a winter flood preparedness meeting, and I'd like to take this opportunity as well to thank everyone who is on duty over the Christmas period.
Dr. Allison Gardner.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My constituency of Stoke-on-Trent South has many farmers, some of whom are personal friends. On their behalf, may I ask the Minister to update the House on the funds it is making available via the Farming Recovery Fund to support farmers impacted by last year's severe weather?
Thank you. Thank my honourable friend. And this government recognises the awful impact that flooding has had on the farming community. We are releasing £60 million via the Farming Recovery Fund to support farmers impacted by last year's severe weather. That's £10 million more than was planned by the previous government. And £55.7 million has now been paid out to over 12,700 farm businesses.
Richard Burgon.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. While the far right, and shamefully even some MPs in this House, are busy denying climate change and trying to turn it into the latest culture war, people in our communities are paying the price. More and more severe floods are devastating people's lives, as we've seen again in recent weeks, and I'm afraid it's only going to get worse. So does the Minister agree it's a disgrace, an absolute disgrace, that the last government left our flood defences in the worst state on record, and that fixing this has to be a national priority and a key part of preparing for climate change?
I thank my honourable friend, and he's absolutely right. The previous government left flood defences in a state of disrepair and in the worst state on record, leaving 60,000 homes exposed. That is why this government is going to be investing £2.4 billion into defences over the next 2 years.
Andrew Snowden.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. In Fylde, we have a number of new housing developments over the years that have been constructed in flood areas where the developers have even known that the construction sites themselves have flooded and still sold properties without disclosing that to the buyers, and in some circumstances where they have not constructed the flood defence requirements and mitigations on site to spec. Both the residents and the councils have felt powerless to be able to get the developers to correct what should have been right in the first place, and a number of them have flooded several times since people have purchased. So what plans does the Minister have to be able to give residents and councils more power to hold developers to account when they don't properly construct or disclose information around flooding?
I thank the honourable gentleman for his question, and I share his upset at the lack of the rules being implemented by the previous government when it comes to housing and flooding. We need to see more sustainable urban drainage in more developments, and it's important that we see those built into the planning applications to begin with. And if you'd like to contact me, I can look into this in more detail for him.
Obese-Jecty.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Across Huntingdon, flooding continues to be an issue that impacts a huge number of constituencies, with flooding almost inevitable every time it rains. Allconbury Flood Group is a leading flood group within the constituency, and Charles Dalleywater has been a driving force in implementing flood mitigation measures such as the recently opened Alderman's Retention Pond at Sallows Farm that was planned by the flood group after funding was provided by Anglian Water, Huntingdonshire District Council and Cambridgeshire County Council. But what funding is available from the government to facilitate the construction of further retention ponds?
Minister.
Thank the honourable gentleman for his question, and I'd also like to thank all of the flood action groups and groups around the country doing this incredible work for the communities, and that sounds like a brilliant example. As I've mentioned before, we are investing £2.4 billion over the next couple of years, and I should hopefully be able to give more detail in the new year.
Rebecca Smith.
Question number 2, Mr. Speaker.
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I start by wishing you a happy Christmas and all your staff, and also thanking all those who work in our food system to make sure that we're fed every day, particularly at this time of year, and making sure that so many of our constituents can enjoy a traditional, wonderful British celebration. Now, the autumn statement on the 30th of October confirmed the DEFRA budgets for 24-25 and 25-26, and funding allocations for individual programmes will be determined in upcoming months through the Department's business planning exercise, and will be updating the House on the Rural England Prosperity Fund in due course.
Rebecca Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you for that answer. Farmers in my constituency in South West Devon have highlighted the role that the Rural England Prosperity Fund could play in the economic growth of our community. Given the publication of the English Devolution White Paper this week, what conversations has the Minister had with the Department for Housing, Communities and Local Government about how funding such as the Rural England Prosperity Fund can ensure that devolution is a success for the countryside?
Minister.
Well, I'm grateful to the Honourable Lady for her question. Of course, we're in constant dialogue with our colleagues in MHCLG, and I was delighted that there will be, on average, areas with a significant rural population will receive around a 5% increase in their core spending power, which is a real terms increase. So I hope we can continue to work well to address that rural productivity gap of some 18%, which is a real challenge for all of us.
Sir John Whittington.
Number 3, Speaker.
Secretary of State.
May I also take the opportunity to wish you a very Merry Christmas, Mr. Speaker, and of course your hard-working House staff. The government has committed £5 billion to the agricultural budget over the next 2 years. That's the biggest budget for sustainable food production and nature's recovery in our history. We're also investing £60 million into the Farming Recovery Fund to support farmers affected by unprecedented extreme wet weather last winter. We understand concerns about changes to agricultural property relief, but the majority of those who inherit farmland after a death and claim relief will not be affected by these changes.
Sir John.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. But has the right honourable gentleman seen the latest research, which shows that 75% of commercial farms will exceed the £1 million threshold and therefore become liable for inheritance tax? And just to give him one example, a family in my constituency in West Hanningfield who have farmed for 5 generations now say that they face an inheritance bill of potentially £1.5 million. They say that this will put an end to all that that has gone before and end the aspirations of their family looking forward. Can I plead with the government, look at this again?
Minister. Well, I would, of course, we hear the concerns, but I would say to the honourable gentleman that the last year for which we have actual claims data available, over 75% of claimants would not be affected, and of course, most farms, like every other business, can do their succession planning in the usual way, so they don't have to pay any more than they need to.
Josh Fenton-Glenn.
Thank you, and Merry Christmas, Mr. Speaker. Our hard-working farmers across Calder Valley want to earn a living from farming, not have their land used to avoid tax. After 14 years of neglect from the last government, who undercut them in trade deals, the sector is, however, becoming increasingly unprofitable. I welcome the Labour government's new deal for farmers and the 25-year roadmap to making farming profitable again. Can I seek assurance from the Secretary of State that Calder Valley farmers will get their fair share in this new deal and the new improved countryside stewardship higher tier scheme next year?
Well, I'm grateful to my honourable friend, and he will be aware, as I am, that the Shadow Secretary of State, as well as the former Prime Minister, keep telling farmers they're not in it for the money. We know that they are. They're businesses that need to make a profit, and our new deal for farmers, including increasing farm supply chain fairness, is intended to make farms profitable and successful for the future in a way that they were not under the previous government.
Dr Neil Hudson, the Shadow Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the autumn budget put family farms in jeopardy. Now, these farms also need biosecurity to protect their futures. With avian influenza spreading, blue tongue still with us, and African swine fever at our doorstep in Europe, biosecurity is national security. Central to that is the Animal and Plant Health Agency, whose HQ in Weybridge needs a £2.8 billion redevelopment to protect farming, animal, plant and public health. The Conservative government quite rightly started this work with £1.2 billion committed in 2020. I note that Labour have committed £200 million to support this transformation. But, Mr. Speaker, this will not touch the sides. Will the Minister confirm that the government will complete this project in full, as the Minister called for in opposition, and commit the remaining £1.4 billion to protect our nation's biosecurity and prevent an animal disease outbreak catastrophe?
I'm grateful to the honourable gentleman, and he does raise a very important point, but I do find it a little ironic that members opposite are calling for this government to commit spending that their government never committed. The Weybridge facility for biosecurity is it's so dilapidated, it's facing obsolescence by the early 2030s. That is the legacy that they left. The £208 million we have committed will start the process of improving those facilities, and through the spending review phase that is coming forwards, we will look at how we can commit further funding to ensure the biosecurity for farmers that they absolutely failed to do.
Liberal Democrat spokesperson Tim Farron.
Mr. Speaker, and a very Merry Christmas to you and indeed to all here and beyond. Farmers in my communities across the country are genuinely devastated by the government's family farm tax, which will affect many in my patch who are on less than the minimum wage. Devastated by that, but also by the 76% cut in basic payment that will take place next year. But perhaps what dismays farmers across our country and in Westmoreland even more than that is the overall agricultural policy of this government and its Conservative predecessor to actively disincentivise farmers from producing food, despite the fact that in this country we now only produce 55% of the food that we need. Isn't this a dereliction of duty from both front benches and a threat to our national security? So what plans has he got to change his policy and back our farmers to actually produce food?
Well, the Right Honourable Gentleman raises a number of very important points there. I'll repeat my comments earlier on about APR. The last year for which we have data available shows that the vast majority of claimants will not pay anything. This government, unlike the previous government that thought farmers were not in it for the money, wants them to succeed. So we're embarking on a farming roadmap and a new deal for farming that will look at supply chain fairness, stopping farmers being undercut in trade deals like the one they agreed with Australia and New Zealand. Our intention is to make farming profitable for the future. Their record is 12,000 farming businesses that went bust.
Munira Wilson.
Question number 4, Mr. Speaker.
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the Honourable Lady for raising this really important issue. The Drinking Water Inspectorate requires water companies to monitor, report and assess the risks from PFAS, and we're aware of concerns relating to this and officials are working on it.
Munira.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and a happy Christmas to you. I thank the Minister for her answer and for offering me a meeting on this topic earlier this week, which I look forward to pursuing with her. But could she tell the House why it is, given the wealth of authoritative evidence about the harmful impact on human health of PFAS in our drinking water, why it is that when Scotland, the European Union and the United States have all put guidance on PFAS into law on a statutory footing, why it is that this government appears to have no plans to do so for England and Wales, and will she look at amendments to the Water Special Measures Bill to this effect?
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And as I've mentioned, this is an important issue and I do look forward to discussing it in more detail. But work is continuing to assess the risks from PFAS and to inform policy and regulatory approaches, including banning or highly restricting certain chemicals and addressing issues caused by their historic use. PFAS chemicals and their persistence once in the environment means there are no quick fixes, but this is a global challenge, and innovation of suitable PFAS alternatives is also needed, and we're working to harness industry leadership in the transition away from PFAS. But just to reassure her again, work is going on this issue.
Where are votes?
Number 6, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and can I wish you and all the staff of the House and those people in our public services who will be working over the weekend a very Merry Christmas and a very safe and successful New Year. The UK has a long history of championing the global conservation of endangered species. We're in the process of extending the Ivory Act to include 4 further species: hippopotamus, killer whale, narwhal and sperm whale, in addition to elephants. This government has also committed to ban imports of hunting trophies. We are considering the most effective way to do so.
Where are Hobart?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It is now 10 years since the senseless killing of Cecil the lion. It is still legal to import hunting trophies into this country. There's cross-party support for a long time to ban trophy hunting. In 2023, the Labour Party said to the then Conservative Party, what is stopping the government to bringing in legislation and stop dithering and delaying? Why is this government still dithering and delaying?
Well, with the greatest of respect, Mr. Speaker, she was in government for 5 years. Her party was in government for 5 years, and as she says, the party opposite was in government for 14 years. It's always good after 5 months in office to be criticised for previous failures, but I will agree with her that the party opposite can't be trusted on animal welfare. They failed to pass the trophy hunting bill that would have stopped selfish hunters who slaughter and display endangered animals' body parts for their own perverse self-gratification, and drop the kept animals bill that would have ended puppy smuggling, puppy farming and pet theft. And as I say, we are looking for a suitable legislative vehicle, and we will do it in government time.
Josh Dubé.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and Merry Christmas. This time of year brings festive cheer, but it also brings the Boxing Day hunt. Alongside many of my constituents, I'm keen to see an end to the smokescreen that is trail hunting. Following the last Labour government's historic fox hunting ban, will the Minister confirm this Labour government's commitment to banning trail hunting once and for all?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We have indeed committed to a ban on trail hunting, which will provide significant protections to wild animals, including foxes and hares. Work to determine the best approach for doing so is ongoing, and further announcements will be made in due course.
Colorado.
Number 7, Mr. Speaker.
Secretary of State.
Speaker, the public are sick and tired of the scandal of sewage polluting our rivers, lakes and seas. That's why we are taking immediate action to place water companies under special measures with a new bill that will give the regulator the power to ban the payment of undeserved bonuses for polluting water companies and bring criminal charges against persistent lawbreakers. We are also carrying out the biggest review of the water sector since privatisation to shape further legislation that will transform how our water system works and clean up our rivers, lakes and seas for good.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And last year there were 3,366 hours of sewage dumping into the rivers and streams of Altrincham and Sale West, leaving Cinderland, Broke the Bollin and other waterways in a terrible condition. So could the Secretary of State outline further how the government's Water Special Measures Bill will ensure the end of sewage dumping into the rivers and streams of my constituency for good?
Well, I congratulate my honourable friend for being such a champion for clean rivers in his constituency of Altrincham and Sale West. The bill, as I said before, will ban the payment of undeserved bonuses to water executives who are responsible for this kind of pollution, and it will ensure instead that money is spent where it should always have been spent, on fixing the infrastructure so we can stop once and for all the kind of sewage scandal that is polluting the rivers that his constituencies are so aghast to see on their doorstep.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and Merry Christmas to yourself and your staff. And I declare my interest as co-chair of the all-party group on water pollution. Now, while I welcome the measures that are being taken by the government to take some limited measures to tackle pollution from the water industry, there is an elephant in the room here, because agricultural pollution is just as important a source of pollution of our rivers, lakes and seas. So can I ask the Secretary of State, please, what will he commit to doing to tackle with the same degree of urgency and focus the problem of agricultural pollution, and how will he support farmers who stand ready to take action themselves to tackle this by providing the funding and support and the clear regulatory enforcement that is needed for a level playing field? Thank you.
Well, I thank her for raising such a very important issue, and of course I recognise that over 40% of pollution in our waterways comes from agricultural runoff. Sir John Cunliffe and the commission that he is leading will be looking at all sources of pollution into our water. The budgets that we've committed to a more sustainable forms of agriculture will be seeking to reduce the use of fertiliser so there's less runoff into our water, and the farming roadmap that we're working on with the farming community is intended to also reduce the amount of runoff from agriculture into our waterways. We're also looking at moving to a whole catchment-based model, so we're looking at all sources of pollution into water so we can clean up all of our rivers, lakes and seas from whatever source the pollution comes.
Robbie Moore, Shadow Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And can I take this opportunity to wish you and indeed all in the House a very Merry Christmas. Mr. Speaker, many customers are quite rightly concerned about Thames Water and the situation that they find themselves in. So, for the third time of asking the Secretary of State in this chamber, will he confirm that he will not issue any regulatory easement to Thames Water in his discussions with them, so that their environmental obligations and service commitments to their customers will not be reduced?
So state.
Well, the government continues to keep a very close monitoring view over what is happening at Thames Water and indeed all the other water companies. But the only easements that I've ever seen given to water companies over pollution were the previous government, who turned a blind eye as sewage was flooding through our rivers, lakes and seas. This government is putting the water companies under tough regulatory special measures. Measures the previous government could have enacted but failed to do.
Exactly.
Number 8, sir.
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As my honourable friend knows, each week 8 million vapes, such as single-use, pod and big puff, are now thrown away or recycled incorrectly. That's 13 vapes a second. That is why we have already banned single-use vapes and created 10,000 extra vape recycling points in store. And we will ensure online marketplaces and vape producers pay their share of electronic recycling costs to avoid the fires that we know are so devastating.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I wish you and your team a very happy Christmas. Thank the Minister for her reply. We're all keen to increase recycling, but too often the opportunities for electronic waste recycling are very limited. And this is meaning it's going into the mainstream waste, leading to increased pollution and hazards. We're seeing increased bin fires, with vapes, as she has highlighted, being a particular problem. Could the government look at what opportunities there are to work with local authorities to increase the recycling opportunities, and particularly, I'm sure the public are aware of the downside of not disposing of these things properly?
Minister.
Can I thank my honourable friend for that question? Indeed, my own City Council of Coventry has introduced small electrical item take-back points in its libraries, an example of an excellent council innovating. I've recently visited Curry's recycling plant in Newark, which showed the importance of recycling electricals to make sure that the gifts of Christmas past can be conserved and used for many Christmases to come. But more importantly, for the last-minute Christmas shoppers, Mr. Speaker, you will get £5 off a new product, and I hear air fryers are very popular.
Gideon Amos.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. May I wish you and all a Merry Christmas. We know that electronic goods and similar goods in the landfill can leach into our waterways and affect water quality. Can I ask the Minister whether the government will reintroduce water restoration funding as part of the package of measures he was talking about earlier, so that the River Tone and bathing stations elsewhere across the country can benefit from cleaner water as a result of restored water restoration funding?
Minister.
Well, certainly the intention of our policy is to tackle fly tipping, to tackle all sorts of, to stop persistent organic pollutants entering the environment, but I will have to consult with my honourable friend, the Minister for Water, to answer him on that detailed point.
Richard Tash.
Question 9, Mr. Speaker.
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Dredging can be a useful option for managing flood risk, usually as part of a wider approach where it is technically and cost-effective and does not significantly increase flood risk for others. And of course, we need to adopt the best solution for each place.
Richard Tash.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and a Merry Christmas to one and all. My constituents of Boston and Skegness are very concerned that the Environment Agency is not able to properly maintain riverbanks and to properly dredge rivers in order to protect homes and livelihoods because of the very demanding requirements of Natural England regarding the protection of badgers and water voles, meaning the priorities are wrong. Will the Minister meet with me and senior people at the Environment Agency to ensure we get these priorities correct?
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the honourable gentleman for his question. Dredging used to be commonplace, but some evidence shows that it can speed up flow and potentially increase the risk of flooding downstream. There are no plans currently for any further dredging in Boston and Skegness, but if the honourable gentleman would like, I'd be happy to meet with him and the EA area manager to discuss this further.
Blake Stevenson.
Number 10, Mr. Speaker.
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We all know that food security is national security, and we also, most of us, recognise that the impacts of climate change and nature loss pose a significant risk to domestic production. So it's very important that we use our land carefully, and consequently the government will be introducing a land use framework to make sure that we can protect our most productive agricultural land.
Thank you,
Mr. Speaker. High-grade agricultural land in mid-Bedfordshire has been farmed for generations. It's critical for our food security and our freedom. But it's under extreme pressure. We talked about climate change and flooding here this morning. We talked about the government family farm tax and also urban sprawl. That hasn't been mentioned this morning so much, but urban sprawl is a major threat to high-grade agricultural land. We live in an uncertain world and we need our country to feed itself. Considering the threats, will the Secretary of State guarantee that high-grade agricultural land will be protected by this government?
Minister.
Well, I thank the honourable gentleman for the points that he makes, and I refer to my earlier comments, really, that we see more and more pressure, that there are so many things we need to do on our land to house people, to feed people, so it's important we have a proper structure in place. And I think it's widely acknowledged the current planning system doesn't necessarily do that. The previous government promised a land use framework. What we will do is actually deliver a land use framework.
We come to Topicals, Danny Beales.
Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, I share customers' anger at the water bill rises announced by Ofwat this morning. Customers have been left to pay the price of Conservative failure after the previous government let companies spend millions on bonuses and shareholder payouts instead of investing in our crumbling sewage infrastructure. If you find cracks in your house and do nothing about it for over a decade, the problem gets worse and the cost of fixing it escalates, and that is exactly what has happened to our sewage system. We've introduced the Water Special Measures Bill to curb unjustified bonuses. Money earmarked for investment will be ring-fenced, so it can only be spent on infrastructure, not bonuses and shareholder payouts, as happened under them. And I've appointed Sir John Cunliffe to lead a commission into the regulation of the water industry so that the failures that led to today's bill rises can never happen again. This government will end the Tory sewage scandal once and for all.
Danny Beales.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Recent investigations have shown that a lack of investment in drainage infrastructure has contributed to local significant flooding in Uxbridge and South Ruislip. I'd like to ask the front bench, how will water companies like Thames Water be held to account where their lack of investment blights communities through repeated flooding?
I thank my honourable friend for his question. The government, of course, recognises the importance and the need of having a robust drainage system, but he will be aware that the previous government failed to ensure adequate investment to maintain and upgrade it. Water companies have a duty to ensure that the area they serve is effectually drained. This includes drainage of surface water from the land around buildings, as well as the provision of sewers.
So, Secretary of State Victoria Ratkin.
Merry Christmas, Mr. Speaker, and to everyone in the House, particularly also to our farming, food, hospitality and water sectors this Christmas. But not everyone will be able to celebrate Christmas. In recent weeks, a farmer took himself off to a remote part of his farm and killed himself. The message he left his family, who wished to remain anonymous, is that he did this because he feared becoming a financial burden to his family because of changes to inheritance tax. This is the human cost of the figures that the Secretary of State provides so casually. What does the Secretary of State say to that grieving family?
Secretary of State.
I send my heartfelt sympathies to that family, but I think it is irresponsible in the extreme to seek to weaponise a personal tragedy of that kind in this way. Where there is mental ill health, then there needs to be support for that, and this government is investing in it. She knows from the last year for which data is available that the vast majority of claimants will pay absolutely nothing following the changes to APR.
Victoria Atkins.
How heartless, and also how extraordinary that the Secretary of State is more discomforted by being presented with the facts of the consequences of his policy than the reality of what this policy ensures. I can say, Mr. Speaker, I was a minister for 7.5 years. I've never, ever seen a policy have the consequences that this one has. But we know that there is a tragically, and they are now members of the public will see the members opposite reacting in that way because I have dared to present the facts to them. We know that there is a tragically high suicide rate amongst the farming community. The NFU gave evidence about this. The Secretary of State has been told repeatedly. Will he collect data on a monthly basis of suicides from farmers, farming families, landowners and family businesses so that we, the House and the outside community, can understand the human costs of this tax policy before it comes into force?
Mental health services are the responsibility of the National Health Service. And the former health secretary who broke the NHS is in no position to lecture anybody about public services. She was no friend of the health services, no friend of the mental health services, and she is no friend of farming. 12,000 farms went bust on their watch. They failed to get £300,000 out of the doors and into the pockets and bank accounts of farmers, and they signed a trade deal with Australia that undercut British farmers on environmental and welfare standards. I hear the posturing. It is this government that is standing up for farming.
Patrick Hurley.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I met with farmers in the northern parishes of my constituency recently, and they told me about the urgent need for improved water management to protect farmland. They want to establish an internal drainage board for flood management, but they can't take action to set it up until the necessary statutory instrument is in place. So given the importance of establishing an IDB in my area, will the Minister commit to working with me and stakeholders to reduce flood risks, and will they commit to outlining when the statutory instrument for an IDB in my area might be put before the House?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd be delighted to work with my honourable friend on this really important issue. The Association of Drainage Authorities are on the Flood Resilience Task Force, and the statutory instrument will be laid as soon as parliamentary time allows.
John Milne.
A farmer in my constituency of Horsham tells me that even in a good year, he's lucky to see much beyond £20,000 a year in profit. With margins as wafer thin as that, regular farming barely qualifies as investable at all. The risk of losing a huge slice of that farm to IHT at random intervals therefore goes not only to put this generation out of business, it will go a long way to ensure that they can never be replaced. Does the Minister agree that this measure...
I'm not going to sit down. We really need to get our act together. This is the shortest set of topicals. I'm not going to get people in. We've really got to stick and remember what topicals are always about. I hope you've got the gist of that, Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And the point that farmers need to get a better return from their business is very well made, and that is exactly what this government will be addressing.
Sir Edwards.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and you, your team and colleagues across the House. My constituents of Tamworth have long felt the impacts of flooding, and many residents have been isolated in rural areas after a storm. I've produced a flooding report recently. Please would the Minister meet with me to discuss it so I may support the work of the department.
Excellent. There we are.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and that's a very easy short answer. Of course, I'd be delighted to meet with her.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. North Cornwall has world-class beaches and rivers, but Santa swims have been cancelled due to the constant dumping of raw sewage. Meanwhile, water companies receive millions from bill payers, but then the very next day give it away to their shareholders. Does the Minister agree that the best gift he could give my constituents this Christmas is a total ban on water bill rises until South West water bosses finally end this scandal?
The honourable gentleman is quite right to point to the scandalous situation the previous government left our waterways in, with record levels of pollution, raw sewage, filthing our rivers, lakes and seas. I've appointed Sir John Cunliffe to lead a commission to review governance and regulation so we can stop it ever happening again.
David Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to welcome the £5 billion landmark £5 billion agricultural budget announced in the autumn statement, the biggest ever budget for sustainable farming. Now, that's money that my farmers in North Northumberland desperately need. So in that context, can I ask my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State, what more he can do to push for his department to get that money out the door in a way that the previous government did not do?
Minister.
Well, I thank my honourable friend for his question, and he's absolutely right. It was extraordinary, wasn't it? The last government managed not to spend £300 million of the farm budget. We're absolutely determined to make sure that we do better in the future. I wish he and his farmers a very Merry Christmas.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In my constituency of Carshot in Wellington, we have an incinerator that regularly breaches its air pollution limits, but the EA does nothing about it. So will the government tell us what they're doing to give the EA teeth?
Matters of incineration permit breaches are, of course, a matter for the regulator, the Environment Agency, but we are reviewing energy from waste capacity across the country and will be making a statement imminently.
Mr.
Speaker, and happy Hanukkah to those who are observing. What action is this government taking to promote the purchasing of British-grown and seasonal produce through its public procurement framework?
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank my honourable friend for his question. We're absolutely determined to make sure that we see more British produce bought across our public sector, and we'll come back to the House in due course with our plans.
Chair of the Select Committee, Alistair Carmichael.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It would be very helpful if the Secretary of State would encourage Sir John to engage with parliamentarians across the House. The necessary changes that he has outlined are going to take time, however. The truth of the matter is that if those who currently have responsibility were to change their culture and to focus on outcomes for customers rather than their own internal processes, we might see earlier improvements.
I thank the Chair of the Select Committee for his question. There will be an opportunity for members to engage with Sir John Cunliffe's Commission in January. In the new year, I'm sure his committee will want to do precisely that. The Water Special Measures Bill going through Parliament right now is intended to make quick changes to the system. Sir John Cunliffe's review will give us the chance to reform regulation and governance for the long-term future.
Jenny Riddle-Carpenter.
I recently met with the Old and All Estuary Trust, who have been long campaigning and fundraising to refurbish and secure flood defences on the Old and All Estuary. Will the Minister meet with me to discuss the Trust projects and the barriers to progress?
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Each question I come here and promise I won't arrange to meet with as many members, and each time I fail. So, of course, I'd be happy to meet with my honourable friend.
Final question, John Glenn.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last year I visited the Loddington project, the Allerton project in Loddington by GWCT. Can I commend the contribution that they can make to defining sustainable intensification of agricultural food production, and perhaps it would be a suitable place for a DEFRA ministerial away day early in the new year to help them with their land use strategy.
Minister.
Well, I thank the honourable gentleman for his suggestion. I'm a great admirer of the Allison project. I've been meaning to visit for a long time. My officials are working on a visit, and I'm really looking forward to engaging with them because they do great work.
To the questions, Tim Farron.
It is related to the questions we've just had, and I thank you for granting the point of order. This morning at 7 o'clock, entirely foreseeably, Ofwat announced bill rises of 36% for water bill payers around the country. That's a 14 times larger increase than current inflation. We know a large proportion of that rise will be spent on paying off the debt of water companies, a debt got simply by paying dividends that were unearned and bonuses that were undeserved. Is it in order for the government to have known this was coming and not have come to this House and made a statement today so that we can hold them to account for their failure to make sure Ofwat has got the teeth they need to hold the water companies to account?
Well, I thank the honourable member for his point of order. I have received no notification from the government of such a statement, but he certainly put his point on the record. I'm sure it will have been heard by the Treasury benches. Right, we know.